In the history of warfare, victory usually belongs to the side with the most tanks, the most bullets, and the most men. But in 1944, as the United States prepared for the invasion of Europe, the Pentagon came to a strange realization. Sometimes, you don't need to be stronger than the enemy. Sometimes, you just need to be smarter. This is the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. But history knows them by a different name, the Ghost Army. To understand how this unit came to be, you have to leave the muddy trenches and step into the sunlit art studios of New York City and Philadelphia. In late 1943, the U.S. Army began a recruitment drive unlike any other. They didn't go to shooting ranges or athletic fields. Instead, Army recruiters walked into the classrooms of the Pratt Institute, Cooper Union, and the Cleveland School of Art. They were looking for a specific kind of soldier. They didn't ask, "Can you shoot?" They asked, "Can you draw? Can you sculpt? Can you make a stage set look like a castle?" The Army had observed the British success in North Africa, where deception tactics had fooled the Germans. Now, America wanted its own dedicated unit of deceivers. They needed men who understood perspective, shadow, light, and acting. The result was a motley collection of 1,100 men that looked less like a military unit and more like a traveling circus. The ranks were filled with fashion designers, aspiring architects, abstract painters, and set builders from Broadway. Among them was Bill Blass, who would later become a world-famous fashion icon. There was Ellsworth Kelly, the future giant of minimalist painting. There was Arthur Singer, who would become one of America's greatest bird illustrators. But in 1944, they were just kids with sketchpads drafted into a secret war. They were sent to Camp Forest, Tennessee, for training. It was a clash of cultures. The regular Army officers, hardened men of discipline and drill, didn't know what to make of these bohemians. While other infantry units spent their free time cleaning rifles or playing cards, the barracks of the 23rd looked like an art gallery. Soldiers would spend their evenings sketching portraits of each other. They painted watercolors of the Tennessee landscape. They designed elaborate logos for their uniforms. One officer recalled walking into a tent to find a private arguing passionately not about military tactics, but about the proper use of negative space in a composition. But their mission was deadly serious. They were formed into 4 distinct subunits, but the heart of the artistic effort was the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. Their job was not to hide the Army, but to simulate it. The training was bizarre. They weren't taught how to storm a beach. They were taught how to stage a production. They learned the art of bad camouflage. If you hide a tank perfectly, the enemy doesn't see it. But if you hide a fake tank imperfectly, the enemy sees it, believes it's real, and wastes artillery firing at it. They learned to work with rubber, wood, and canvas. They learned that a battalion of tanks leaves specific tracks in the mud, and if you want to fool a German aerial scout, you have to recreate those tracks using bulldozers. They learned that an army isn't just machines. It's an atmosphere. It's laundry hanging on lines, it's garbage pits, it's the specific insignia painted on a bumper. For these young artists, the war became a massive canvas. They were told that their job was to land in Europe and act as bait. They would project the image of a massive force, 20,000 or 30,000 men, while only being 1,100 strong. They would draw the fire of the panzer divisions so that the real American units could attack from the flank. As they packed their gear for shipment to England, the mood was a mix of excitement and absurdity. They carried M1 Garand rifles, but their most important weapons were air compressors and paint sprayers. They were the ultimate bluff. They were about to enter the bloodiest conflict in human history armed with nothing but imagination. The artists of the Ghost Army were trading their paintbrushes for rifles, but they weren't going to Europe to fight the Germans. They were going there to haunt them. The magic of the Ghost Army was not built on spells or sorcery. It was built on physics, engineering, and pure theatrical audacity. To fool the sophisticated German war machine, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops developed a 4-pronged strategy. They didn't just want the enemy to see a threat. They wanted them to hear it, intercept it, and believe it. These were the 4 pillars of deception. The first pillar was visual. This was the domain of the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, the artists we met in the previous chapter. Their weapon of choice was the pneumatic decoy. Imagine an M4 Sherman tank. In reality, it is a 30-ton beast of solid steel that shakes the ground when it moves. The Ghost Army's version was made of neoprene-coated fabric and weighed only 93 pounds. These inflatables were masterpieces of design. Deflated, an entire tank battalion could fit into a few duffel bags. But once connected to an air compressor, they swelled into shape in 20 minutes. From a distance of 500 yards, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. The artists paid obsessive attention to detail. They realized that a rubber tank doesn't rust, so they painted rust streaks on them. They realized that the turret barrel on the inflatable tended to droop sadly like a wilted flower, so they reinforced it with aluminum tubes to keep it menacingly straight. But a visual lie is easily exposed if it doesn't leave a footprint. The artists knew that a 30-ton tank chews up the earth. A rubber balloon sits gently on the grass. So, they used bulldozers to tear up the fields around the decoys, creating fake tank tracks that led specifically to the inflatable models. To a German reconnaissance pilot flying at 5,000 feet, the story was perfect. A heavy armored division had just arrived and dug in. The second pillar was sonic. This was the most technologically advanced and perhaps the most terrifying part of the illusion. The 3,132nd Signal Service Company was responsible for the soundtrack of the war. Long before digital audio, these engineers went to Fort Knox and recorded the specific sounds of armored warfare on wire recorders. They captured the deep, guttural roar of a tank engine, the squeak of treads on pavement, and the clanking of metal bridges being built. They took these sounds to Europe and loaded them onto massive, 500-pound speakers mounted on the back of half-tracks. They called them the boomers. The fidelity was terrifying. These speakers could project the sound of a moving tank column up to 15 miles away. They could mix the audio live, layering the sounds. If the script called for a tank column moving away, they would fade the volume. If the script called for a stalled truck, they played the sound of a grinding starter motor. On dark, foggy nights along the front line, German soldiers would freeze in their foxholes, convinced that a massive American offensive was grinding toward them, terrified by the noise of an army that wasn't there. The third pillar was radio. This was the scriptwriting department. German intelligence relied heavily on intercepting Allied radio traffic. The Ghost Army's radio operators were highly trained actors. They didn't just tap out Morse code. They mimicked the fist, the unique typing rhythm, of specific operators from real units. They created vast, complex radio networks. They would spend days sending boring, routine messages back and forth, requests for extra fuel, reports on broken equipment, and weather updates. To a German listener, this volume of bureaucratic traffic could only mean one thing: a division of 15,000 men is operating in this sector. In reality, it was 2 guys in a truck, frantically typing to each other to create the illusion of a crowd. The fourth and final pillar was atmosphere or special effects. This was the most dangerous job. It required the soldiers to be method actors. The Ghost Army would sew the patches of real units, like the 75th Infantry or the 6th Armored, onto their own uniforms. Then they would drive their trucks into local French towns. They would go to cafes, drink wine, and accidentally talk too loud. They would complain about their general. They would brag about their upcoming attack. They knew that French towns were full of German spies and collaborators. The goal was for the spies to overhear them and report back to Berlin. I saw soldiers from the 6th Armored Division in the cafe today. It was a multimedia performance of life and death. The balloon created the shape, the speaker created the fear, the radio created the data, and the actor created the reality. When these 4 pillars stood together, they built a fortress of lies so strong that even the most experienced German generals believed it was real. But for the men inside the illusion, the danger was constant. One punctured balloon, One skipped record or one loose patch, and the entire house of cards would collapse under enemy fire. In June 1944, the artists of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops waited ashore in France. They arrived a few weeks after D-Day, stepping into a landscape that had already been chewed up by war. The hedgerows of Normandy smelled of rotting apples, churned mud, and cordite. Up until this moment, their deception was theoretical. They had practiced in the forests of Tennessee and the fields of England. They knew how to inflate a tank and how to broadcast a sound. But they didn't know the answer to the most terrifying question of all. Would the Germans actually buy it? And if they did, would the Ghost Army survive the attention? Their first major test came in August 1944, during the siege of the port city of Brest. General George Patton's Third Army was smashing its way across France, but they were stretched thin. One of the real American tank units, the 6th Armored Division, had to leave its position to attack the city. This created a massive, dangerous gap in the Allied line. If the Germans noticed the Americans had left, they could pour through the hole and flank the entire army. The order came down: plug the hole with the ghosts. Under the cover of darkness, the 1,100 artists moved into the positions just vacated by 15,000 real soldiers. It was a terrifying magic trick performed on a stage of mud and blood. The men of the 603rd worked feverishly. In the gloom of the twilight, they unpacked their rubber M4 Shermans. They connected the compressors, and slowly, the limp fabric rose into the menacing shapes of armored beasts. They positioned them under camouflage nets, intentionally leaving the barrels visible just enough for enemy binoculars to catch a glimpse. Meanwhile, the sonic trucks, the boomers, began their performance. They blasted the sounds of tank engines revving and tracks clanking. They projected the audio deep into the German lines, painting a sonic picture of a restless, powerful armored division preparing to attack. Then they waited. This was the unique psychological horror of being in the Ghost Army. In a normal unit, you pray the enemy doesn't see you. In the Ghost Army, your entire mission is to make sure the enemy does see you. You are waving a red flag at a bull, armed with nothing but a sewing kit. The Germans took the bait. Their observation posts reported heavy tank activity. Their radio interceptors picked up the fake chatter. Convinced that the American 6th Armored was still there, the German commanders held their fire and kept their troops in place to defend against an attack that would never come. But the illusion came with close calls. There is a famous story from these early days that highlights the absurdity of their war. During an artillery barrage, a German shell landed close to one of the inflatable tanks. Shrapnel tore through the rubber skin. But instead of exploding in a ball of fire and twisted metal, the tank did something impossible. It hissed. As the air began to leak out, the 30-ton war machine started to wilt. The gun barrel drooped sadly toward the ground. The turret began to sag. Panic set in among the artists. If the Germans saw a tank deflating like a birthday balloon, the secret would be out. The deception would fail, and the 1,100 men, armed only with light rifles, would be massacred by the very real German panzers just a few hundred yards away. A team of artists sprinted out of their foxholes, dodging mortar fire. They weren't carrying ammo boxes. They were carrying duct tape and glue. In the middle of a battlefield, under the nose of the Wehrmacht, they performed emergency surgery on the balloon, patching the holes and reinflating the tank before the sun came up. When dawn broke, the tank was sitting proud and rigid once again. The Germans, looking through their optics, saw a steel fortress. They had no idea they were looking at a bag of air held together by adhesive and adrenaline. The siege of Brest was a success. The real 6th Armored Division took the city, while the Ghost Army held the flank with nothing but shadows. They had proven that the concept worked. But they also realized the grim reality of their new life. They were the professional targets of the U.S. Army. And the next time, the Germans might not just fire a warning shot. By March 1945, the Nazi Empire was crumbling, but it had one final, formidable moat protecting its heart: the Rhine River. Crossing the Rhine was the final hurdle for the Allied forces. The Germans knew this. They massed their remaining artillery and panzer divisions along the eastern bank, waiting for the Americans to try and swim across. A direct assault against prepared German defenses would be a suicide mission. The river would run red with blood. The Allied command came up with a plan. The real Ninth Army would cross at a place called Wesel. But to make that possible, they needed the Germans to believe the attack was happening 10 miles south, near the town of Viersen. They called in the artists. This was Operation Viersen. It was not just another mission. It was the Ghost Army's masterpiece. It was the largest, most complex, and most dangerous deception of the entire war. For this grand illusion, the 1,100 men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had to impersonate 2 full infantry divisions, over 30,000 men. They had to make the Germans believe that a massive invasion force was gathering in the fields of Viersen, preparing to storm the river. The artists worked with the intensity of a Broadway crew on opening night. They deployed over 600 inflatable tanks and trucks. They filled the fields with rubber artillery pieces. But they didn't just park them. They choreographed them. They moved the balloons at night to simulate a buildup of forces. They used bulldozers to scar the earth, creating fresh tracks that led to the riverbank. But the visual lie was only half the battle. The deception required sound. The sonic trucks rolled up to the river's edge, dangerously close to the enemy. They pointed their massive speakers across the water and began to play a mixed tape of war. They played the sounds of trucks gearing down, sergeants shouting orders, and the clanking of heavy pontoons being unloaded. They played the specific rhythmic sound of a bridge being built. To the German listeners in the bunkers on the other side, the audio story was undeniable. The Americans were building a crossing right here, right now. The Ghost Army even simulated an artillery barrage. They didn't have heavy guns, so they used flash canisters, small pyrotechnic charges that popped with a bright flash and a bang. From a distance, in the dark, it looked exactly like a battery of 105mm howitzers firing. The deception was so convincing that Axis Sally, the famous German radio propagandist, took the bait. She broadcast a message specifically addressing the Ghost Army's position, taunting the 30th and 79th Divisions that she knew were preparing to cross at Viersen. She warned them that the warm German welcome was waiting. She was right. The welcome was waiting, but for an army that didn't exist. On the night of March 23, 1945, the trap snapped shut. The German commanders, convinced by the sights and sounds of the artists, shifted their reserves to Viersen. They opened fire. They pounded the empty fields with heavy artillery. They wasted tons of ammunition blowing up rubber tanks and churning up empty mud. 10 miles to the north, the real Ninth Army slipped into the water. The result was stunning. The real troops crossed the Rhine with almost no resistance. They expected a bloodbath. Instead, they found empty bunkers. The German defenders were miles away, fighting shadows. Winston Churchill and General Eisenhower were present to watch the real crossing. They were amazed at how light the casualties were. While they watched history being made, the artists of the Ghost Army were packing up their deflated tanks and turning off their speakers. Operation Viersen saved an estimated 30,000 lives that night. The artists had fought the German army with nothing but hot air and sound waves. And they had won. They had staged the greatest show of the war, and the only applause they received was the sound of German shells landing harmlessly in the dirt. In the summer of 1945, the guns fell silent. The ships returned to New York Harbor, and ticker-tape parades welcomed the heroes home. Infantrymen told stories of storming beaches. Pilots told stories of dogfights. But the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the men who had staged the greatest illusions of the war, were given a different order: shut up. The Pentagon classified the existence of the Ghost Army as top secret. The war was over, but the Cold War was beginning. The Army realized that the tactics of deception, inflatable tanks, sonic projection, and radio spoofing might be needed again against the Soviets. They didn't want the world to know how easily they had fooled the Germans. So the artists took a final oath of silence. They went home to their wives, their parents, and their children, and they lied. When asked what they did in the war, they gave vague answers. "I was in the engineers," one would say. "I blew up bridges," another would lie. For 50 years, they locked their sketchbooks in attics and buried their memories. They lived with the strange burden of having saved 30,000 lives, yet being unable to claim credit for a single one. They returned to the art world, and strangely, the Ghost Army experience began to bleed into American culture, hidden in plain sight. Many of the soldiers became legends in the creative industries. Bill Blass, who had spent the war inflating rubber tanks, applied his sense of structure and form to become one of the most famous fashion designers in American history. Ellsworth Kelly, who had studied the art of camouflage and shadows to hide from German planes, became a giant of the minimalist art movement, famous for his bold, abstract shapes. Art Kane, a soldier in the Ghost Army, became a legendary photographer, capturing the famous Great Day in Harlem portrait of jazz musicians. For decades, the artistic DNA of America was being shaped by men who had learned their craft on the battlefields of France, using art to deceive death. The silence was finally broken in 1996. The government declassified the files. The Ghost Army was no longer a secret. The revelation was shocking, even to the families of the veterans. Wives who had been married for 40 years suddenly learned that their husbands weren't just clerks or truck drivers. They were battlefield magicians. Grandfathers pulled dusty boxes from their basements, revealing sketches of French villages and photos of inflatable tanks that looked like toys. One veteran recalled the moment he could finally tell the truth. "It was like taking off a mask I had worn for half a century, but the recognition came late. By the time the story was public, many of the 1,100 men were gone. They had died with their secret." In the years that followed, a campaign began to give these men the honor they deserved. It wasn't about bravery in the traditional sense. They hadn't charged machine gun nests. They had drawn fire away from them. They hadn't captured ground. They had pretended to occupy it. Finally, in March 2024, the United States bestowed its highest civilian honor upon the unit. 3 of the last surviving members, men nearly 100 years old, traveled to Washington, D.C. to receive the Congressional Gold Medal. Standing there, frail but proud, they represented the 1,100. The medal was the final act of their service. It was the official acknowledgement that imagination is a weapon of war. The legacy of the Ghost Army is not written in blood, but in the lives of the men who came home because of them. Somewhere in America today, there are thousands of people, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of the soldiers of the Ninth Army, who exist only because a group of artists stood in a muddy field in 1945, inflated a rubber tank, and convinced the enemy to shoot at a ghost.